Previously on the British Broadcasting Century's 100 Years in 100 Minutes, for a third of a century, the BBC was the sole official broadcaster in the land. But now we reach part two of our whiz through the century, 1955 to 1987, and there's a new kid on the block, commercial television in ITV.
I think one of the most deplorable mistakes ever made in public affairs was made when the BBC monopoly was broken. I think it was shocking.
John Reith had left nearly 20 years earlier, yet commented,
The public, by and large, was satisfied with the BBC as it was before the monopoly was broken. Anyhow, when I left it.
1955.
As ITV launches, the BBC tries to sneak some audience away by killing off Grace Archer. Spoilers. It's also the end of Muffin the Mule, the start of Benny Hill, This Is Your Life, Dixon of Dock Green, and the first appearance of TV chef Fanny Cradock.
We make indents with our fingers, firmly, all the way round, you see, like that.
Now, while part one contained more archive, we're treading the right side of right. We are nothing to do with the BBC. This is entirely independently made. And so in parts 2 and 3, expect more insights from podcast listeners, experts, and those who are there. 1956. Go right back to 1922 and you hear a lot about Arthur Burrows, first voice of the BBC. Well, he had gone to the EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, although then it was called the UIR. One of the ideas there was to unite European countries with one broadcast that could be experienced by the whole of Europe at once. And even before World War II, there had been an idea to include some kind of song contest. It wasn't Burrows' idea, but he was incredibly behind it. Unfortunately, war came along and that put an end to that. Until now. Yes, 1956, Eurovision. Radio stars Elsie and Doris Waters began a sitcom called Flog It, written by future Dalek creator Terry Nation, and it was the debut of Ronnie Barker. Tony Hancock made it to television.
Here's Paul Hayes.
The way Hancock uses the television format, how good he is at doing that occasional nod and a wink to the audience. When things have broken down slightly, someone stumbled over a line, and he gives that kind of knowing look and might step out of character just for a moment. So, right, come on, we've got to get back into this now. And it's all the more surprising that he's so good at this when you learn that he hated doing that. He wanted to switch to doing his sitcoms single camera film without an audience because he hated that live performance aspect of it so much. And yet he was so good at doing it.
1957. The Sky at Night Test Match Special, Broadcasting for Schools, Panorama broadcaster Spaghetti Tree Hoax, the first regional news, and the launch of the Today programme. Former guest of ours, Justin Webb.
I think radio does open up the world in a different way, with an energy, I suppose. So for that reason, it did the job for me, and I think it still does the job today.
It was also the end of the toddler's truce, and here's more from academic Dr. Amy Holdsworth, whose book is On Living with Television.
The toddler's truce ran until 1957, when broadcasting closed down between 6 and 7 p.m. It would help parents and carers get their children to bed, so it'd be a cue for bedtime. So rather than having the distractions of the TV, they could focus on getting the children to bed instead. So that's a kind of really powerful example of the power of broadcasting and the power of the kind of state at that point to govern the kind of temporal schedules of people's lives in the home.
In 1958, a certain TV show hit our screens. They started a tradition that my daughter here has continued to this day. Hello, daughter.
Hello.
Now, we put something in the post today, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
Could you describe what it is and what it's for?
Well, it was a letter to Blue Peter, and it was for them to see because I like my blue badge.
Ah, blue badge. And do you have a badge already for Blue Peter?
Yes, I've got my green badge.
You've got a green badge, and this is after a blue badge. And children have been doing this since 1963, nearly 50 years of this.
Yeah, it's really cool.
So another 50 years of Blue Peter badges, do you think?
Yeah, probably.
The start of Grandstand, Richard Dimbleby demonstrates Vera, which is an early way of recording television programmes. When he shows us how it works on TV, he instantly plays back footage of himself. It's a modern miracle. Speaking of which, St Clare of Assisi is made patron saint of television by the Pope. Oh, and it's the start of the radiophonic workshop at Maida Vale.
59, and the Navy Lark was first afloat, with John Pertwee, Dennis Price and Leslie Phillips on the boat. Soon Price jumped ship, and Stephen Murray dept, left hand down a bit, then crashed. The crew was quite inept.
The start of the Ken Dodd Show. On that, from Doddy to Diddy, it's David Hamilton.
The Ken Dodd story was that I remember we went there the first day of rehearsals, and I stood next to Ken, who's probably about, half a foot taller than me. And the only people there, well, there was no audience. There were makeup girls, props boys, cameramen. And he looked at me and he said, "What do you think, Diddy David?" So everybody chuckled. And in fairness to him, he took me to one side afterwards and he said, "Do you mind me calling you that?" He said, "Because if you mind, I won't do it anymore." He said, "But if you don't mind," he said, "I think I better warn you, it might stick." Well, I don't mind. And I've been stuck with it now for how many years is it? It's been a while, yes.
1960. A question mark doodled on the back of an envelope becomes the blueprint of Television Centre. And having been turned down by one of the finest producers in the north of England, Olive Shapley, on the BBC, Coronation Street finds its way to ITV. I don't think it will last. 1961. Points of view, and when the powers that be relax the rules on what can be broadcast on a Sunday evening, in other words, something can be broadcast, TV exec Donald Bavistock has an idea. Some favourite sing-along hymns from our youth. Songs of praise.
Some of the early songs of praises, the locations were chosen based on where the football was played the day before.
Yeah,
well, okay,
Songs of Praise started. I think it was the first one was in the OB trucks are in Cardiff or somewhere. They thought, well, we've got these vans here. Why don't we, do something else?
Steptoe and Son is very influential. It was remade in America as Sanford and Son and did hundreds of episodes.
They did loads more, didn't they?
Yeah, and when one of the characters left, it became Sanford Arms, and then that became Sanford. So, it went for a long time, and 16 of the original Steptoe scripts were actually reshot almost word for word.
So that was like The Office of its day, in a way.
And it was also remade in Sweden as Albert and Herbert. Visually very similar. I can't really understand what's happening, so I don't know if all the jokes are the same or not.
I don't know what you dirty old man is in, Norwegian, but something. And then 1962, TW3, otherwise known as That Was the Week That Was.
Fantastic show, Beyond the Fringe Movement, that whole satire boom. Frost, whilst making the Frost Report, the follow-up to TW3, was concording across the Atlantic, the American version of That Was the Week That Was, the first episode of which starred Gene Hackman.
His way of corralling the comedy writers of the Pythons and, Barry Cryer and the goodies, and get them all together and work out, you should write with you and you should write with you, and then go forth and make brilliant comedy troupes in the decades to come.
It was also the year that a high-ranking exec, Eric Maschwitz, who was at the BBC in the golden years of radio, he'd been to Hollywood to write Nightingale Sang on Berkeley Square, and he'd come back to television. Here's Paul Hayes.
He was the assistant and advisor to the controller of programmes. And in early 1962, Eric Maschwitz asked the BBC's script department to look at the possibility of the BBC making a science fiction programme. The very first document in the Doctor Who file is the script department's report that they prepared for Eric Maschwitz. I was able to go to the BBC Written Archive Centre at Caversham and opening this file that's got those original documents in, and right at the start of the file is this report that Eric Maschwitz commissioned. The following year, the whole process of creation of Doctor Who kicked off, as it were.
And 1963, the launch of Doctor Who.
Russell T Davies once wrote that in the future, Doctor Who will be the case study for how British television drama was made, because it is almost certainly the most studied British television drama series ever. There are books and articles and documentaries on almost any aspect of its history that you care to mention.
Your book is called The Long Game, 1996 to 2003, the inside story of how the BBC brought back Doctor Who.
But that isn't the future, or the past. Or perhaps for the Doctor, it doesn't matter.
1964, the end of the children's hour, finally. But maybe the children have moved on, because it's now the start of Top of the Pops. Also, we're at a crossroads. It's Crossroads. And Vision On, the Wednesday Play, Play School, Horizon, and BBC Two is launched. Unfortunately, there's a power cut and a kangaroo stuck in a lift. An auspicious start. 1965. The first black children's TV presenter, Paul Danker, Magic Roundabout and Jackanory, Till Death Us Do Part.
Which is the first Alf Garnett? In Sickness and in Health, Till Death Us Do Part.
For richer, for poorer. No, they never got that far, did they?
But that was offered to ITV halfway through its run, part of a big negotiation package for better recompense for the writers and things.
Here's Charles Huff.
Dennis Mayne Wilson. At the time when I was working with him, he was working on a programme called Till Death Us Do Part. He had, of course, been a radio producer before. He was the man who started the Goons. And he's probably the greatest radio producer that ever was. I remember him telling me why Dandy Nichols left Till Death Us Do Part. Basically, the reason being she couldn't stand Warren Mitchell. Great actor, but a bit of a pain.
William Hardcastle on The World at One, when The World at One was in its pomp and Suddenly people were using a thing called the telephone to just do live interviews with people around the world, and everyone thought it was really amazing. And all of that sort of stuff I was aware of as a child because I was desperate to get out of my circumstances, and suddenly realized, the outside world was there. And I also realised that I wanted to be part of it.
And helping children dream about science for many a year. Tomorrow's World. It certainly had an impact on TV presenter Gareth Jones.
I did actually end up presenting Tomorrow's World very briefly. I presented the last series, which is great. I cried on the day that I got given that job. I broke my heart because all my presenter heroes were Tomorrow's World presenters. William Woolard, James Burke, Raymond Baxter. These are the people who I copied when I became a TV presenter. I intoned like William Woolard. I thought like Raymond Baxter. Those are my models. So I have a lot to thank them for. So to finally become a presenter of their show some 30 years later, perhaps, a great moment for me. Heartbreakingly happy.
1966 will, of course, be known for the year of the World Cup. It was also the year Match of the Day launched. Cathy Come Home at one end of the spectrum, the Money programme at the other, and Terry Wogan's first show for the BBC. And an early producer for Wogan, there on the BBC Light programme, was Johnny Beerling.
Wogan was working for RTE, Radio Televise Iran. And they didn't mind him working on the BBC as well, but they wouldn't give him sufficient time off to come over every week. He was doing a programme called Midday Spin. Only the BBC could come up with the title that, Midday Spin. Anyway, an hour of gramophone records. Anyway, so they said, well, look, every fourth week you'll have to go over to Dublin and produce Terry from there. So I would trot over on the plane and meet Terry. We would go out round the pubs of Dublin, doing research, of course. And then in the morning we would do it from the studios of RTE. And it was a very similar setup to the BBC. They had people to play the records, people to mix the sound. But Terry was, very inventive and a clever presenter. And of course he was soon offered a contract on a more permanent basis to the old BBC Light programme as it was then.
In 1967, the BBC commissioned a song for the world's first ever live satellite international television link-up. That song was written by the Beatles, and it was All You Need Is Love. This was a year of changing music on the radio. Goodbye Home Service and the Light programme.
Well, there we end broadcasting in the Light programme, not just for today, but as it seems, forever.
Goodbye Home Service. Two of the best words in the British language. And still, I'm sure, the only answer you can give to the question, what is radio for?
BBC Radio turns into radios 1, 2, 3 and 4.
10 seconds to go before Radio 1, Tony Blackburn, and Radio 2, Paul Hollingdale. Stand by for switching. Get tuned to Radio 1 or 2. 5, 4, 3. Radio 2, Radio 1, go.
The voice of Radio 1.
We've spoken to 3 people who were there that day. Producer Johnny Beerling, presenter Emperor Rosko, and singer of The Settlers, Cindy Kent.
I'm one of the only, I think probably the only person for the BBC that went out to see the pirate ships. I told my boss I wanted to go and have a look, and he said, I'd rather not know about that.
Really?
So I managed to wangle a trip out. I met people like Tony Blackburn, Keith Skews, Kenny Everett. Even John Peel was there, I think, at the time. What amazed me when I saw it was that everything was what we call self-operation, self-op, as it is now in local radio, as you know. But in those days, they would play their own records, play in the jingles. So, of course, one of the big problems once Radio 1 was set up, there was nowhere in the BBC where people could play their own records, except in the continuity studios, where announcers had the ability to play a record in the event of an awful breakdown or something. So we had to modify continuity studios and design them so that they could do this self-operation.
A fellow showed up from Radio 1 who was a producer, and he said, you should come, and we're launching Radio 1, an answer to the pirates, and we'd like you to be on it.
They brought in the Marine Offences Act, which was making it illegal to service the ships. Tony had cleverly come ashore 6 months before Radio 1 started, at least. I had got to know him, and they asked me if I'd like to produce the first ever programme. I didn't realise how historic that was at the time.
I believe the Settlers were the 12th record to be played, a song called Major to Minor. It's a momentous occasion. It was like, wow, this is incredible. Because up until then, we knew about pirate radio, of course. They played all our stuff, which was lovely. And the BBC played stuff that you went in and did. But this was like, oh, Radio 1, wow. It was history, wasn't it, really?
Elsewhere in 1967, the first colour television on BBC Two, Trumpton, Just a Minute, The Test Card Girl, Carol Hersey, and BBC Radio Leicester becomes the first local station. 1968, sitcom writer James Cary.
For a while, I used to put on Twitter every single week without fail a screen grab of the best rated comedy on BBC Two, Channel 4 and Channel 5. And it was always Dad's Army.
Someone who actually joined the stage show of Dad's Army when it was still on television. You may know him from Heidi High. It's Geoffrey Holland.
Jimmy rang me up and said, would I like to play Walker? I think he's bit his arm off, And so, yes, I played Walker as well. And I was a member of Captain Mannering's platoon for 6 months.
Wonderful. So you're on stage then with Arthur Lowe and...
On the Measure I've done, Me and Lavender, yeah. John Laurie didn't do the show because he was rather old then, and his wife wasn't well, so he stayed at home. And Arnold Ridley, actually, who always looked about 90, actually turned 80 on the tour. I mean, he was a professional old man, Arnold Ridley. Wonderful man. He was a sweetheart, absolute sweetheart.
More from Geoffrey Holland soon on the podcast.
1969, Letter from America, the first all-night BBC television broadcast in Apollo 11.
Right throughout my childhood years, the most important thing for me was the moon landing.
The moon landings in the summer of 1969.
Reeta Chakrabarti.
I was 4.5. I have a very strong memory of my father sitting me down in front of our old black and white, well, they were all black and white then, black and white TV saying, look at this, you've got to watch this, you've got to remember this. And I did, and I do.
Alec Reid.
I went to television presentation, and my main claim to fame there was sitting in the international control room for 24 hours, didn't leave the chair for 24 hours, relaying the pictures of the first moonwalk around Europe as they came in. And I was supposed to have been relieved after 4 hours or 6 hours or whatever. It's an all-night shift, but everybody else was sitting in the office glued to the screen and wouldn't come and read me.
Oh, no, I bet.
Interestingly enough, the sound and video arrived out of sync. The pictures arrived before the sound did.
Oh, right.
Time I had to get up and put my hand on a tape recorder and sort of adjust so that they go more or less in sync again and then sit down.
It was the first major world event that I do remember.
Nationwide, the BBC Globe ident comes in. BBC One gets colour, and Monty Python's Flying Circus. They were very eager to have David Hamilton.
It was the beginning of Monty Python, very early days of it, and somebody from the show had said, what we'd like to do is we'd like to have the Thames logo and their announcer, David Hamilton, introduce the programme. So I went down, I met them all, Cleese and Palin and the rest of the gang, and they were all lovely, very welcoming. And then I sat down at the microphone and I read out the words. Good evening. There are some terrific programmes for you tonight on Thames. But first, here's a load of old rubbish on the BBC.
1970. The first same-sex kiss on UK television. Play for the day. In religious radio circles, pause for thought and thought for the day. You and yours. And the start of Open University as 1970 becomes 1971, bringing us the two Ronnies and the Generation Game. Oh yes, a golden era of Saturday night television. It's also the time that the Blue Peter time capsule was buried.
And the launch of Pebble Mill. An early editor was Maurice Blisson.
I used to file stuff for the local BBC newsroom, Birmingham, Pebble Mill. In its infancy, brought out evening programmes like Midlands Today and Points West and all that. And I became a sub-editor on one of those. We had skateboarding ducks and things like that.
1972, Pebble Mill launches afternoon schedules, the start of News Round, and Terry Wogan joins Radio 2 at breakfast. He's there from 1972 to 84, and then again from 1993 to 2009. And here's a loyal listener, Reverend Cindy Kent.
He was talking to me, and I know you probably think he was talking to you, but I'm sorry, Paul, he was talking to me. And I felt that whenever I listened to him.
Cindy Kent went on to become one of our first commercial broadcasters, as in 1973 we gained LBC and Capital Radio. Suddenly BBC Radio had competition. Over in Teleland, though, we had That's Life, Last of the Summer Wine, The Wombles, Some Mothers Do Have 'Em, Open All Hours, Porridge as well. A glorious year for sitcom. But back in Radioland, Johnny Beerling came up with something rather special, the Radio 1 Roadshow.
We used to go on camping holidays in France. And we're down in the south of France one year, and I saw all these people with the little aluminium chairs trotting across the campsite. A Pantechnicon with a side that let down and formed a stage. And they did a show which was a mixture of live music and records and comedians in French, which I didn't understand very well. And I thought, if we could travel a show like this French one around the countryside. BBC obviously didn't own any sort of vehicle like that. And somebody said, well, there's a guy down in Bristol, John Miles, he said, my brother Tony could build one. Anyway, he built the first one, and we took it down to Newquay, and I think it was 1973 was the first one. Alan Freeman was the disc jockey, and it worked marvellously. That was my idea, because I wanted people to get away from that notion that it's that BBC down there in London. It's not part of us. I wanted to give them a sense of ownership. You know, I'm proud to say it ran it for something like 27 years.
1974. Engineer Norman Green.
The BBC came up with a proposal for CFAX, and the IBA came up with a proposal for Oracle at the time. We at ITV did quite a lot of research with people who had bad eyesight. I came up with the idea of making the characters double height.
I remember the double height characters.
Right. Yes. Well, double height characters.
And that's you. You're the double height.
Yeah, I had the patent on that. Yes.
1975. Sitcom's golden era continues with The Good Life and Fawlty Towers. Brian Redhead joins today. The news headline starts to become the longest-running topical comedy show anywhere in the world. In fact, I can tell you that was my first writing credit. I thought if I can get a job on this, it will never get cancelled. And I finally got my first ever joke sold onto what turned out to be the last ever episode of the news headlines. But it started then in 75. It was also the year of a show that, alas, we don't remember too fondly, Jim'll Fix It, which is troublesome for the daughter of the director who had such happy memories in spite of its host. Here's Belinda Campbell.
My dad was the director of Jim'll Fix It. He was the director in the 80s, and so as a kid I used to go to Jim'll Fix It all the time and to the studios. I got to meet all my favourite pop stars. I had a great time. It was magical.
The people who are still around from the Jim'll Fix It,
Yeah.
they must have, again, it must be a very confusing...
Yeah, I think they feel... I was
for
quite protective over them at the beginning, so I remember writing to Roger Ordish saying, don't you ever forget how much hard work you put into this, and don't let it undo that. But once they were proud to speak about their career, you can't see into people's minds. You might see something in their eyes, but people can disguise things so well, especially if their neck's on the line.
That full interview from Paul's other old podcast, a Paul Carenza podcast. Details in the show notes.
In 1976, Claudius on the screen. It was the start of Roman numerals in television credits.
Next, McMilksVI. I mean MCMLXXVII. I mean
1977. The Morecambe and Wise Christmas special. Will we e'er see the like of those viewing figures for light entertainment ever again? Also the beginnings of Morph. And launched by presenters including Angela Rippon, it's the start of Top Gear. Now, I worked on Top Gear for a little while. If you'd like to know the identity of the Stig, I can tell you it is 1978. Finally, the end of the black and white minstrels after 20 years. And Grange Hill.
Chicken Man, the theme. The bow, 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 bow.
Is that called Chicken Man?
Yeah, it's by Alan Hawkshaw. But here's the best fact about that.
Go on, Simon Dunn.
At the same time, it could be heard on ITV.
What?
The show Give Us a Clue. The Give Us a Clue used that tune, ever so slightly rearranged, slightly different pace from 1979 to 1981. So if you were a kid running around in the late 70s, early 80s, and you heard that tune, you might have run in
expecting to see
a giant sausage, but no, you would just see
Lionel Blair doing. I should now insert some sort of Lionel Blair innuendo that I'm sorry I haven't a clue was so fond of using.
It was March 1978.
Andrew Barker.
I was a diligent reader of the Radio Times and a member of the BBC listening panel. A new late-night comedy series was scheduled for broadcast on BBC Radio 4. The weekly sheet that I'd received for the listening panel also featured this programme. The sheet, filled in by its 2,000 or so members, requested the listener, if they chose to hear the programme, to rate how much they enjoyed it. A 5-point scale from A+ to C- was used for the listener's response. I listened to that first episode and gave it a rating of A, and wrote that I had enjoyed it very much. For the following 5 episodes, I rated them all A+, and noted that this was the best radio comedy series I had ever heard. That series was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. With all its various repeats over the years, it became the most popular radio comedy series of all time.
1979, Life on Earth, Radio 2 is the first BBC station to go 24 hours. Question Time with Robin Day and To the Manor Born, Simon Dunn.
The most watched TV show of the 1970s.
No.
If you believe the BBC, it got 27 million. The official JICTAR ratings put it at 24.6. It started at the height of the ITV strike, which had shut down the ITV channels. It was running against a caption card on ITV, apologising for the strike and no service, which was still getting ratings of 1 million viewers.
Really?
People
Wow.
leaving their tellies on, perhaps, or they might have enjoyed the music.
My name is Charles Huff. I used to produce and direct programmes for BBC Television Science Department. I series produced a series called The Great Egg Race with Professor Heinz Wolff as our presenter. Totally eccentric programme, but great fun to do.
The Antiques Roadshow, and in more political circles, Panorama covers developments with the IRA in Carrickmore. Now, this angers the government, and losing his job over it, Roger Bolton.
The BBC and the government occasionally seem to come into orbit with each other.
They did. I mean, when I got fired for a weekend, and that was over a programme that was never completed, we're making a film about the origins of the IRA, and one of our teams, Jeremy Paxman, actually filmed the IRA taking over a village in Northern Ireland. Now, they may have done it actually just for publicity. They may not. We didn't have a chance, though, to decide whether to show that material or not, and I'm not sure if we would have shown it. The BBC was in a weak position, desperately needed a licence fee increase. It was negotiating with government. That always gives the government a lot of power. Basically, they wanted the BBC to not ask difficult questions. Well, what's the point about the BBC if you don't ask difficult questions? Well, that was what we tried to do. Well, it always gets you in trouble.
In 1980, Children in Need gains Pudsey Bear. In other TV animal news, it's the start of Watchdog. We gain Newsnight and Heidi Hi.
Ho-de ho. Here's Geoffrey Holland on Paul Shane.
They searched a long time before they found Ted Bovis. Jimmy saw him on Coronation Street, quite by chance, and rang David up and said, "David, are you watching Cary?" He said, "No." I said, "Put it on quick. I think we found Ted Bovis." And there he was, playing Alf Roberts' boss in Cary. It was perfect. That was the sort of rough diamond they were looking for, the same northern accent. And I met him for the first time, and they already booked me, Spike. The chemistry was instant. All the years we worked together, we worked together for 18 years altogether. There was just a magical ping. Something went click.
1981, a simple wedding between someone called Charles and someone called Diana breaks viewing records. On the radio, Lord of the Rings, and on children's television, Postman Pat, and in sitcom land.
Nothing brings our country together like a sitcom. Only Fools and Horses matters, doesn't it? That is the great sitcom of the English language, is Only Fools and Horses. It won Britain's best sitcom 20 years ago. There's been some other good shows now and then, but the BBC sitcom, they really have churned out an awful lot of them. I don't think anything's come along which would make us knock that off the top spot.
In 1982, the launch of the BBC microcomputer, Listen with Mother, ends. The Falklands War starts, and there's controversy over the BBC not calling them our troops, but British troops, trying to keep an objective distance. And in lighter fare, Madder Jaffrey starts cooking up some curries for us. 1983, the launch of the first breakfast television show, Breakfast Time.
Maurice Blisson.
Breakfast news I helped to set up, but we only set it up in a rush because ITV were going to do TVAM. So we thought we'd better get in first, and we did by 2 weeks.
It's also the start of EastEnders. And I have a cunning plan. It's the launch of Blackadder. Former BBC employee George Orwell famously wrote of 1984, and it turned out to be a rather serious year. It was the launch of Crime Watch, and Michael Burke gave a very serious BBC News report from Ethiopia. That meant in 1985, Live Aid. And one of the people who helped make that happen, Johnny Beerling.
1985, I was in charge of Radio 1. The idea was that we would do the sound, but of course Bob Geldof was very much behind the scenes. One of the problems of the BBC was that it had not allowed its airwaves to be used to fundraise. And Geldof's attitude was, if I can't get the money, then you're not going to get rights to broadcast.
In other fundraising news that year, it was the start of comic relief. BBC Idents gained a new globe. We had Children's BBC, and we had Victoria Wood as seen on television.
I was working in the presentation department in Studio B when Mike Fish did the very last magnetic rubber weather. That was in February 1985. And he actually said, this is the last time you'll be seeing these metal symbols sliding down the chart, because tomorrow will be all electronic. And the crew all went into the studio, into Pres A, and said, Mike, can we have a couple of weather symbols as a souvenir? and we were allowed to take 2 each. But there were hundreds of them. I mean, there were drawers full of those things. And then recently, watching the Antiques Roadshow, there was a chap on there who had about 50 of them. And I was astonished because we'd been allowed to have 2 each. And apparently he'd just written to BBC Presentation and said, now that you're not using them, may I have them?
Yes.
And they were all bundled up and sent off to him. So he has one of each. They've lived on my fridge door for the last...
I could imagine. I was thinking the fridge is the perfect place for them if not the exhibition.
1986, the start of Casualty, the start of Neighbours, which unbelievably has just been recommissioned. EastEnders had a very serious Christmas special from Den and Ange, and there was a very serious episode of the Late Late Breakfast Show with the sad death of Michael Lush. And a small part of broadcasting history, perhaps, but Alan Stafford remembers a certain unusual guest host on Radio 4's
Midweek with Libby Purvis. Radio 4 at its most anodyne. Until one Wednesday in 1986.
Good morning. My name is Arthur Mullard, and I'm taking over from Libby because she's gone away for a bit.
Libby's producer was destined for greater things. Victor Lewis Smith would be responsible for some of the edgiest comedy on radio and TV. So while Libby Purvis was on holiday, he decided to give Radio 4 a culture shock. Rather than a voice in Arthur's ear, Victor was frequently heard on Talkback, attempting to steer Arthur back to the straight and narrow. One of Arthur's guests was Ivan Owen, the voice of Basil Brush. Arthur told him,
I saw this documentary on TV where a dog had sex with a fox. Keep it clean,
shouted Victor. Other guests were Roy Hudd and Barry Cryer, so raucous laughter was guaranteed throughout. The show finished with Arthur Mullard's rendition of
I Did It My Way,
accompanied by a male a cappella chorus. Arthur finished at least 8 bars before everybody else. The whole show was a messy celebration of anarchy and chaos, and I loved every minute.
In 1987,
Jenny Murray joins Woman's Hour.
Michael Fish didn't predict a hurricane.
Princess San is on A Question of Sport. Oliver Reed's on Something on Aspel and Company.
We were going for gold. We were going live.
The end of the 2 Ronnies, but the start of Fry and Laurie.
And French and Saunders.
And, to me, to you, it's Chuckle Vision. And yes, we are going to end this third of a century on the Chuckle Brothers. Deal with it.
This has been 100 Years in 100 Minutes Part 2. In Part 3, we'll journey from 1988 to 2022 and see the BBC find its feet in a new digital landscape, racing through to the end of this British broadcasting century.
Presented and produced by me, Paul Carenza. Original music by Will Farmer. Archive material is public domain as far as we know. BBC content is used with kind permission. BBC copyright content reproduced courtesy of the British Broadcasting Corporation. All rights reserved.
If you like what we do, patreon.com/Paul Carenza supports this podcast, or share it. Stay informed, educated and entertained. And join us next time for the 100 Years in 100 Minutes special.
Part 3.